Hey there, Modern Mystics. Alanna here. Happy New Year and happy new decade. I know that if you're anything like me, at the beginning of any year, you're doing whatever you can to optimize the months ahead. So I wanted to dedicate this podcast to talking about one of my absolute favorite ways to do just that, to forecast or take advantage of the situation, the climate, the energies that are happening for you right now to create the best possible path forward. Now, this isn't fortune telling, but it is divination. So we're going to dive deeply into what divination is exactly, how it applies to you as a modern mystic, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my favorite method of divination, which is the tarot. Welcome to the Modern Mystics Podcast. I'm your host, Alanna, the yoga doctor. I'm here to help you realize your potential as a spiritual leader and elevate your work in the realm of yoga, mysticism, and spirituality. This podcast covers all of our favorite topics: yoga, alchemy, astrology, divination, spirituality, psychology, ritual, and mystical practices, both ancient and modern. Get ready to up-level your status as a modern mystic. So the first thing I want to do is debunk any misunderstandings around the concept of divination. Divination can often get a bad rap. We often see it in movies or TV as this really strange, weird thing that people do in order to try to tell fortunes or misdirect or misguide someone. It's not, in my opinion, given the incredible respect that I think it is due. And I also think that because it's cast in this strange light, that we often misunderstand or fear it. And divination doesn't need to be feared. Every culture throughout history has all had its own form of divination. Now, typically it is the shaman of whatever culture or tribe that is the one who is doing the divination, but that doesn't mean that others in the community don't also have their methods of divination. It is very, very dispersed throughout the tribes, throughout people, throughout culture, and again, it's historical and we find it everywhere. Now, the important thing to remember is that each and every tribe and or culture has had its own form of divination, something that works with its personal belief system, something that makes sense to its dynamic and values, something that utilizes the mythology that it itself is absorbed in. So, for example, as I'm speaking to you, I'm thinking right now of African tribes and cultures who often used chicken bones to cast as forms of divination. The chicken was very sacred to these tribes, and they were sacred bones that they used to cast. You may have also heard of runes, which are very sacred to northern tribes, Norway, Denmark. The Norse mythology, in fact, includes runes in its mythology. It was the originator, Odin, who gave the runes to the people to use for divination purposes. So those particular forms of divination are true, appropriate, real, and powerful for those particular tribes, cultures, and mythologies. This is the important thing, I think, for us to remember, especially as modern mystics. We want to use the form of divination that works for us now, okay? And that can be kind of tricky because we as modern people, especially in the West, are a bit more of dispersed, let's say. We have a much more kind of a hodgepodge of belief systems or mythologies, native traditions. Many of us, especially if we're listening to this podcast, many of us have probably walked away from our original religious traditions or spiritual traditions, or we are at least looking at other traditions. We're exploring different pathways, and that honestly, that's a really new thing for us to do as human beings. This is, we're in no man's land right now. As a human population, we haven't really done that in the past, so we have to do things a little differently, think outside the box, but still truly apply some of the same psychological rules and principles that have always been used when it comes to practicing divination, which is to apply the right medicine to the right person, okay? We want to apply the right practice of psychology or spirituality to the right psyche. If we're trying to do something from a culture that doesn't resonate with us truly, or that perhaps we don't come from or understand, it's not that it won't work. It does work. These forms of divination all around the world work. It's just that they may not work for us. So I want to direct us in that way with this groundwork, thinking about this, to a form of divination that culturally actually is sound for us as modern Western people, okay? Because of course there are many, many options. And even though in this podcast, I will direct you to the tarot and I'll give you the reasons for why I will do that, there may actually be other forms of divination that really do resonate with you. Or if you are from a specific or different cultural background, then I want to encourage you to look into what form of divination may be most resonant for you. Just know also that when you're working with clients, your form of divination may not be quite resonant with them. Another example that I have to drive this home a little bit is also the practice of astrology. So I get questions a lot about my astrological practice. I am an astrologer. I certify people to become astrologers. I've been practicing astrology for many years. And because I am a yoga teacher as well and have been practicing yoga for 20 years, people often assume that I practice Eastern astrology or Jyotish. And I actually don't. And the reason is because I am a Westerner and my students and clients are all primarily Western people. Astrology is psychology. And there is a difference between the Eastern and Western psyche. There's no good or bad. This isn't a competition. There's not a hierarchical structure here. There are just differences. Differences are okay. But when we're talking about applying a specific type of psychology to a human being, to a person, we want to, again, apply the right medicine to the right person. So for me as a Westerner, Western astrology fits my psychology. And it's not that I don't appreciate Eastern astrology, and it's not that I haven't done some study of that. Of course I have. I need to know what I'm working with, and I need to understand what that other form looks like, right? That's what a well-rounded mystic does. But ultimately, I'm choosing Western astrology because I'm a Westerner, as are my students. And this is the same reasoning why I've chosen tarot as my primary form of divination. And it's what I teach you, and it's what I teach my clients and students, and it's what I'll talk about here in this podcast. So again, every culture, every tribe throughout history has had a form of divination. It's a way for the shaman or the spiritual leader of the tribe to help others find their best path. Now, it's been, let's just say, skewed. Given short shrift, a bad rap, let's say, in many of our movies and television, and not always. There's actually some movies and television where I think it's been done really, really well, so I don't want to generalize too much. I'm actually specifically thinking of the series Outlander, if any of you watch that. I definitely watch it. I really love it. And there's some really wonderful use of divination in Outlander that I think is beautifully rendered and not made into like a scary prophetic fortune-telling kind of, ominous omen, but rather it's used as a nice guide, a direction for the main character of the story. So anyway, there are places where we see divination given its proper due and proper respect. And of course, I'd like to see more of that. But I want to talk about I want to take a minute to talk about how divination works, okay? Because it's not fortune-telling. Fortune-telling is a skewed use of some of these tools in order to wield power over someone else. And I'm not about that. It's not, what I do. And I feel like it takes away the empowerment of some of these tools like astrology or tarot or other forms of divination that we might use. So real quick, our psyche it's so big, okay? It's so vast. The psyche itself really has 3 parts. We can think about it in that way. And any of you who've taken any psychology courses, I'm certain that you've heard this before. Freud labeled it as the ego, the superego, and the id. Okay, and I don't love those labels, but he did get it right in terms of dividing the psyche up into 3 general parts. There is our conscious mind, which is where we spend most of our time daily interacting with the world through our ego. The ego is part of the conscious mind. But I want to really drive home and stress that the conscious mind is a very small part of the entirety of our psyche. Even though we think it's in the driver's seat, it's really not. The conscious mind is actually pretty much reacting to everything else that the rest of the psyche is delivering to it. It's not even in the back seat, like it's in the trunk, okay? Like kicking and screaming to get out because it doesn't have all the information. And in fact, this is why Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, one of our primary yoga texts, and Patanjali was the author of that text, defines yoga in a very specific way. He says yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. Right now, we can go around and around, and everybody's got their own opinions on what yoga is, but yoga actually does have a very specific definition, and it is a psycho-spiritual definition. There's another definition from a series of texts called the Upanishads, which say that yoga is the uniting or the coming together of the Atman, which is the individual soul, with the Brahman, which is the cosmic source or the collective conscious, okay? So in both definitions, in both of these texts, yoga is not defined by any feeling. It's not defined by your state of body or flexibility. It's very, very clearly defined as a psycho-spiritual state. Patanjali tells us when the mind is quiet, and what he meant by mind was the conscious mind, when your ego is quiet, then it just relaxes and it allows for the wisdom of the other parts of the psyche to come through. And let me tell you, there is great wisdom in the other parts of the psyche. Okay, profound wisdom that you could not even imagine. In fact, wisdom that isn't coming from, quote unquote, you. Wisdom that can come from beyond you, historical, ancestral parts of you, the collective conscious that percolates throughout the world. We have access to so much more, but when we're stuck in our conscious mind or our ego, boy, we can't get there. So yoga truly is the state of yoga, the state of being that is yoga, and yoga is just a word for enlightenment. And many, many cultures throughout history, again, have their own terms for enlightenment. They've all recognized enlightenment. Yoga itself even has many words for enlightenment. Moksha, liberation, nirvana, yoga, samadhi, all terms for enlightenment, right? So many traditions, their goal is this beautiful, blissful state of being, and that is yoga. Well, that occurs when we have access to the other parts of our psyche. So we have our conscious mind, our ego, that's one part. The other part is the unconscious. And this is what we could define as the soul. This is the innermost, deepest part of us. This is the source of our emotions, our triggers, our drives, our urges, the source of our biggest life lessons, the source of our biggest gold, right? So when we are able to do our shadow work, if you've heard of that term, it's quite a popular term in spiritual circles these days. When we do our shadow work, what we're doing is we're diving into our shadow, which is this unconscious, this dark place. For those of you that are Star Wars fans, and I'm hoping that you are. If you're not, or my goodness, if you haven't seen the original trilogy, that is your immediate homework to go out and see it. But there is a key part in one of the films where our main character, Luke, has to go find his darkness. He has to go and do his shadow work, and his mentor, Yoda, sends him into a cave where he literally descends. He goes down into this cave to find the darkest parts of who he is, and he is confronted with Darth Vader, his great nemesis, and he fights Darth Vader in this deep cave. He didn't even expect to find him there, and he beheads Darth Vader, and the skull, or the mask, cracks open to actually reveal Luke's own face. This is a powerful metaphor, and of course the author of this series of movies, George Lucas, knew exactly what he was doing with his mythology, with his story, and that's another podcast. But, when we fight the darkest parts of ourselves, it might look like somebody else. It might look like our enemy. It might look like our lover. It might look like our best friend. It might look like our boss. But ultimately, it is that part of ourself that we have not yet revealed, that we have not yet come to terms with, that we have not yet healed. And it is through this healing that the shadow reveals our gold, and that we eventually become also great leaders and teachers, which is the path that I know you are on as a spiritual leader. So the unconscious is such a huge part of us, and I really love the metaphor of the iceberg, actually, as our conscious, as our psyche. We can look at it as an iceberg, where 10% of the iceberg is actually floating above the water. And it can look formidable, but it's only 10%. And then 90% of that iceberg is floating below the water. And if you remember the story of the Titanic, you know how problematic that can be if you can only see what's on the surface and you don't look below. You have to look below. So there are methods, there are ways for us to get in touch with the unconscious, and I cannot stress enough how absolutely important that is, not just to do this shadow work and to come to terms with the deeper parts of ourselves. I mean, that's really the goal of any one's lifetime, but it's to create this communication between conscious and unconscious, to create this bond, this bridge, this unification, this union between the parts of our psyche. And what is union or unification? It is yoga. It is enlightenment. The spiritual, psychological state of yoga is this bridge, this communication between all the parts of ourselves. When we can access fully, clearly, without the noise or static or ignorance that most people have, then we have that access to so much wisdom, resources. We can move past fear. We can move past judgment. We can move past our triggers. Now, that's just the unconscious, okay? So we've talked about two parts of the psyche. There are three. The other part is our supra-consciousness, okay? What I would think of, or what I would consider to be beyond us or above us, the source, what in Sanskrit would be called the Brahman. This is the all-pervasive source that we all have access to. Everybody can tap into this. This is part of where the collective comes from. This is where ancestral wisdom can come from. Anything that feels it's beyond or outside of us, it's still us. It's still us. In fact, in the Upanishads, it's described as basically the Atman, our individual soul, is a drop of the great ocean, which is Brahman. Okay, a drop is still the same seawater. It's still the same seawater. It's just yearning for the ocean. And to get to that ocean, to have the ability to communicate with that ocean is a gift. So anytime that we receive inspiration, okay, that's coming from the supra-consciousness, what we might call spirit. Spirit is delivering inspiration. And in fact, inside of the word inspiration, we have the same root of the word spirit. When we are inspired, we are literally filled with spirit. So that's where we get inspiration, when we have a gut feeling about something that's coming from our unconscious. So both of these sources of wisdom are incredibly powerful, and we have to have ways to tap into them. We have to have ways to bridge these parts of our psyche that are not immediately known to us. They are not conscious, okay? They are not a part of our conscious mind. So we cannot try to go at them in conscious ways. We cannot just try to look at the unconscious and go, okay, unconscious, tell me what I need to know. It doesn't work that way. You have to use the language that spirit and soul use. You have to speak to them in their language, and you also have to befriend them. And friendship takes time. You have to have several cups of tea before your friend reveals the really dark stuff or the really deep stuff. You have to go out on several dates before you feel comfortable and trusting of someone else with your heart. You have to take time and be consistent with these practices to develop a relationship where spirit and soul will freely speak to you. And they will. In fact, my goodness, they want to. Are you kidding me? Because otherwise they're trying to bang down the doors. They're trying to bang on the gates. And for any of us who have studied the chakras or chakra work, this is a huge way to understand this. If you have chronic pain, if you have any kind of chronic issues, that's your unconscious banging really loudly to say, hey, there's something here to look at. Okay, there's something here to look at. So again, that's another podcast. We've got lots of podcasts, obviously, like coming out of this one. But when we open up the means of communication, when we have this sense of yoga, when we make the state of yoga our new normal, then we have these lines of communication open and can receive these urges, drives, inspirations more clearly. But you need to use the right language, okay? And sometimes the right language requires tools. So for example, there's many, many ways in which we as humans communicate with each other. We talk, sure. We write letters, we email, we text. We use body language. We could use sign language. We use movies. We use television to communicate. We use news, like telephones. There's a myriad of ways to communicate. So let's talk about how these other parts of the psyche communicate. I mentioned a moment ago that the chakras are a powerful form of communication. They are specifically communication from the unconscious. They're communication coming from within us. And luckily, this makes it so easy. Our psyche is organized a little further into levels, into different archetypal regions where we express fundamental human truths. So all of us as humans were born, all of us as humans have family. It's awesome because that's organized in one location within our body, and anything that occurs in that location is a root chakra issue. Very, very simple, okay? Our superconsciousness has this connection to something bigger, something beyond us. And so we need to go beyond just our mind in order to communicate. Our unconscious communicates through mythology. Our superconsciousness communicates through symbol. Through symbol and myth, we have the language of the rest of our psyche. So if you're saying, Alanna, what the heck are you talking about? I'll make this real clear. When you dream at night, are your dreams linear? Are they easily understood? Do they kind of go in circles? Are they fantastical? Are they mythological? The dreams, literally the absolute most foundational communication from the deeper and higher parts of your psyche, come in dream form, they come in myth. Dreams and myth are the foundation of life, of human life on this planet. They are the foundation of our belief systems, our stories, our myths, the foundation of often how we organize our world, of how we treat others. There cannot be enough said about myth, and maybe by this point you know I'm a huge fan of myth. But you have myth and symbol living inside you. When you dream, your psyche is delivering messages to you in a method that you actually should be able to understand. It's not speaking to you with symbols that you wouldn't recognize. It's speaking to you in symbols that you know. It's not speaking to you utilizing myths or stories that are completely foreign. It's speaking to you using myths and stories that you would know. Now, what I don't want you to do after this conversation is go out and buy a dream book. You don't need one. Because again, your psyche knows you very well. And a dream book compiles the kind of collective agreement that when most people see a certain image, these symbols are known. Now, the tarot actually utilizes the same kind of concept. So, for example, for us as Westerners, when we see a rose, we think of love, friendship, right? Real deep intimacy. To give someone a rose is not a trivial gesture. It's kind of a meaningful gesture. And my goodness, if you're given a rose, you're looking into that. You're like, ooh, what does this mean? What does this person mean? Do they feel something for me? You're excited. And that is very specifically a Western phenomenon. Okay, if you go to the East, they don't care much about roses, but for them, a lotus has true and deep meaning. Okay, and that's embedded within their psyche. Same with us. There are other symbols that are very similar. When we see a sun, we think of brightness, lightness. We also think of masculinity. When we see the moon, we think of shadows, darkness, but also femininity. When we see the color red, we think of anger, flashiness, passion, drive. When we see the color blue, it reminds us of memories or water, dreams. So we're working with a pretty common structure of symbols simply based on the nature that we have a Western psyche, which is why a dream book can say, okay, when you see a snake, this is what it means, because in the West, a snake is obviously evil. And I'm kidding there. Actually, it's not. A snake is not evil or good. It has no inherent attribute. None of these things do. It's that we place a value on it because of the stories, the myths, and the collective that we grew up with. And these things are all imprinted very, very young, okay? So what I want to make sure we understand is that the nature of your psyche, it's pretty well set in stone at a very, very young age. So if you were raised from birth to age, say, 5 years old, in the West with Western traditions, you have a Western psyche. And I speak of this because, look, I've been doing yoga for 20 years. A lotus is deeply meaningful for me, but it's not necessarily deeply meaningful for my psyche, okay? My psyche hasn't caught up to the last 20 years of my existence. My psyche is still operating on those really basic, foundational things that were embedded in it as an early young person. So that's why it's important for us to recognize which medicine we need to apply to ourselves. That's why I practice Western astrology and not Eastern astrology. Okay, again, not because there's no judgment here. It's not a good or bad thing. I just know that my psyche is already primed and developed in a Western context. I grew up in America. So this would all be true on the flip side if you grew up in the East, or if you grew up with an Eastern tradition from birth to, say, 5 to maybe 7 years old. That's really where the imprint takes hold and what we need to pay attention to. Okay, so there are some collective symbols. There are some collective messages out there, some things that as soon as we look at them, we understand on a deep unconscious and supraconscious level what we're being told. But often consciously, we don't inquire. We don't dig into that. We receive a dream, for example, and we think, oh my God, I don't know what that means. Let me go to someone else to tell me. Well, unfortunately, someone else didn't receive that dream. You did. And what someone else may interpret it as may be completely different because a symbol might mean something really potent and powerful to you. Okay? So now here we are. I think I've given you a good basis of what divination is, why we need to use a certain kind of divination. We really need to be clear on what type of psyche we're working with. Divination works by accessing these higher and deeper parts of our psyche. Okay, there are parts of us, again, in terms of the brain itself, we only use about 10% of it. That's our conscious mind. There's a whole lot more going on. And when I work with forms of divination, I think of, there's so much more to me than I consciously understand. But it's there. It's there. And it's just because I don't consciously understand it doesn't mean it's not operating. It doesn't mean it's not working. Nobody knows why dreams happen. Nobody knows how dreaming occurs or why it works or why it's even done. It's literally like science cannot crack it. And yet it happens to us every night. And dreams have been the foundations of religions throughout the world for millennia. If you look at the foundational figureheads or stories of religious practices, I guarantee you they're all going to start with a dream. Dreams are powerful. Empires are built off of dreams, and yet nobody can figure out why they exist. So there's something to pay attention to there. That means they're pretty significant. We should really check that out. So as modern mystics, we have that responsibility. We need to find a way not only to decode what energies are happening within us, but to actually access this greater wisdom that we all have access to. This is what divination does. It basically, and I love this metaphor, it lays our cards out on the table. And when we're using the tarot, we're doing that quite literally. We're laying our unconscious cards out on the table. We're pulling the symbols and the myth from within our psyche, and we're actually putting them in front of us to see. We don't have to wonder what's going on in there. We don't have to wait to remember a dream. We can call forth what's alive within us right now through the simple use of divination. I mean, that is both powerful and, frankly, it's miraculous. Okay, a miracle is just a shift in perception. And if a shift in perception isn't a widening of our consciousness, then I don't know what is. So if we can simply widen our consciousness or open our mind enough, if we can quiet the monkey mind, the ego, just enough to let this divination happen, to allow the divination to occur, then we can actually see what is alive within us right now. That is how divination or tarot works. And again, there's lots of forms of divination, but the one that I practice most and the one that I feel fits the best for the modern Western psyche is tarot. And the reason is that the tarot was actually crafted in Europe in around the 14th century is when we first see it. So it literally was born of the most Western symbolic era in history. This is the era of the Renaissance, of the great paintings, of the great interpretive arts. And so the images that those of us in the West have grown up with are imbued into this tarot. That's literally alive with the collective images, symbols that we all know and understand. And I'm specifically speaking of the most popular version of the tarot deck, which is called the Rider-Waite Tarot. Other versions are actually very likely not as symbolically or mythologically potent. Okay, they might be prettier, and that's very possibly true. That there might be prettier versions. There might be versions that seem cooler, right? There might be versions that are more hip, but unless they have really arisen from this deep tradition, they're not going to connect to the actual language of the psyche. And if you're working uphill to try to get the psyche to learn the deck that you've chosen, it's not going to. It's like trying to be best friends with someone who just doesn't speak your language and forcing them to learn your language. I mean, that's frustrating. You know, it's possible, like you can get there in the end, but that other person has to be really invested in you. It doesn't work that way. You want to use the language that's already inbuilt, and we actually do know the mythological structure of the Western psyche, and it's very clearly on display in the Rider-Waite Tarot. So the Rider-Waite Tarot moved the tarot deck that had been evolving throughout Europe forward and was designed and crafted, I believe, in 1901. And it was designed and crafted by a guy named Arthur Edward Waite, and he and his associate, Pamela Coleman, I believe is the name of the artist, were very, very careful to include the original mythology and symbols of the original decks, but again, to move them forward in this more spiritual manner. So it has been the most popular tarot in use for over 100 years, and there is good reason for that. Again, not because it's the prettiest, not because it's the most hip and trendy, but because it actually contains the symbols that your psyche is already imbued with. Okay, so that is why that's so. And look, I've got no investment in the Arthur Edward Waite tarot. Like, I don't get any kickback if you go out and buy one. I just get the satisfaction of knowing that you're actually using a deck that I promise will work for your psyche. I know it will, and I know it will if you are a Westerner. We're good. Like, you're all set. Because there are things in this deck, and I want to give you a few examples here in case this is something that you want to pursue. In the deck, you're going to see animals. And in fact, some of our favorite animals, dogs and cats, right? We domesticate dogs and cats, and we live with them. And in fact, even as I record this podcast right now, my precious little dog Roxy is sitting on my lap, okay, completely asleep, right? So if I see a dog on a card, I'm going to be like overjoyed to see this dog. I'm going to understand that this is man's best friend. And then it represents something alive. I love the the Golden Compass, his Dark Materials is the name of the series, but the first book is his Golden Compass. They introduce animals as daemons. Your soul's living outside your body. Like if you have a pet, then you know what I'm talking about. That's how I feel about my dog, and many of us feel the same way about our pets. Like this is something really primal. This is a drive or an urge. It symbolizes our joy. Where again, as other cultures, they don't feel that way about dogs. They have a different view of dogs. There are other cultures that think dogs are dirty. They need to stay outside. They are not man's best friend. They're not going to have the same reaction that we do when we see a dog on a card. There are sunflowers in the Rider-Waite deck. And again, sunflowers represent solar energy or that light of consciousness. Sunflowers are very much, we see them all. If any of us who have driven through the Midwest in the spring and summer months have seen huge, tall, gorgeous fields of sunflowers literally facing the sun. That is a thing that we know. You may not know that if you come from somewhere else. So again, I'm trying to really drive home this idea that you've got to apply the right medicine to the right person. There are laurel wreaths upon the heads of some of the characters in the tarot deck. And when you see a laurel wreath, you know that there's been victory. That is from the Roman tradition. We've also got some beautiful Greek kind of mythological tradition in the tarot deck. We'll see grapes or pomegranates on many of the cards, which for us represent fertility. And again, that's pretty Western psychic based symbol of fertility. There are different symbols in the East. We've got water, which is always a symbol of the unconscious. Anytime you see anybody diving into the water, they're going into the unconscious. And actually, you can remember that when you go to the movies, too. If there's an ocean crossing, a river crossing, if somebody's going into the water, you're like, okay, they're going into their unconscious now. That's what's happening in the story. We also see that in the deck. There are different colors. I mentioned blue as being memory. White, for us here in the West, is purity. Right? Whereas white in other cultures can mean death. So again, applying the right medicine to the right person. When we see white and when we see white in the cards, we know that there's an element of purity here. There's also a lot of astrological symbolism in the tarot deck. And again, it's Western astrological symbolism. So I'm thinking specifically of one of the major arcana trump cards, card 8, which is strength, where there's a beautiful woman in a white dress, again, that white dress indicating that she is quite pure. She's opening the mouth of a lion. And a lion for us represents real strength. A lion is the king of all beasts. And for this beautiful woman to be leaning down and opening that mouth means that she has control of her own inner strength and empowerment. It's a really beautiful image. So the tarot deck is our opportunity to lay our cards out on the table. And there's nothing magical happening here. Okay, I mean, I guess you could think of it as magical, but it's not, it's not scary or weird. You're just giving your psyche, the bigger and deeper parts of your psyche, an opportunity to speak to you. And I don't know how it works and how it does that, but it does. And it will choose the right cards, again, because there are parts of us, we don't have to know how it works, but it is working. And when we choose the cards and we see the images laid in front of us, we are given very clear messages in a language that we understand in order to move forward. When we learn more about the tarot deck, it's not about memorizing what all 78 cards mean. I mean, that would be incredibly overwhelming and PhD worthy. It's more about looking at the images that are present in every card and knowing what they mean to you, knowing what they symbolize for you. There are a lot of collective commonalities, but the more that you use the deck, the more that you become friends with each and every one of the cards. And the more that you strengthen the relationship between you and your psyche so that you can have a really strong method of communication. So if you pull a card like Strength, for example, this one with the woman in the white dress holding the lion's mouth open, and if the first time you see that, you're struck, let's say, with the innocence and yet power of this feminine figure, and you feel a sense of resonance with that, then your psyche will know, Anytime I need to give a sense of feminine power, I'm going to deliver the Strength card. And that message, that particular word, language, sentence, concept will be strengthened within that card for you. So anytime you need to hear that message, that card will show up. So this is the power and potency of divination. And because I know that you are thinking about the best ways to set yourself up for success in 2020 and beyond, I would strongly encourage you to explore looking into a method like tarot, or you could choose something else that resonates with you, so that you develop this strong communication with other parts of your psyche. And again, my friends, that is yoga. That is yoga, the ability for you to call into accord all the parts of yourself, for you to utilize the strength, the wisdom, the deep urges, the inspiration of all the parts of yourself. That's what's going to help you move forward in the best way possible. If your decision making is coming not from your ego mind, but from spirit or soul, you can be assured that you're making the right decision for you. And if there is a goal to yoga, which there isn't really, but if we could call yoga as having a goal, it would be that brilliant decision making. The Sanskrit word for that is viveka. And to have viveka is to have discernment, to always be able to choose for yourself the best path to fulfilling the greatest potential that you have in this life. Discernment or viveka is your ability to say yes in every moment to the grand adventure that is your life. And when you feel hesitation, when you feel unsure, when you're not certain of what that next decision is or what it should be or how to move forward, what a gift to be able to call on the higher and deeper parts of yourself so that you get that message, you get that clarity to move forward with the wisdom of these parts of you that are so deeply and strongly connected. So I hope that this has been both informational but also inspirational for you. And if you want to continue the conversation and learn a little bit more about the tarot, I'm offering a full lecture this month in my highereducation.yoga membership that takes you through the entire trump card system, which is 22 cards, the most powerful cards in the deck. So that's available to you. I'm giving you a $1 2-week trial, so come and jump in and check that lecture out. Head over to highereducation.yoga/trial, and you can get that full tarot lecture and plus much, much more content. The highereducation.membership is the place where you and I continue conversations like this all the time, and you meet other people who are just like you, modern mystics interested in stepping into their roles as spiritual leaders. As always, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please feel free to leave me a review wherever it is that you found this podcast. Not only gives me a huge warm fuzzy and I'm filled with gratitude for it, but it also helps other people to find this podcast too. And if there's anything I'm interested in, it's spreading the word and helping as many people as possible step into their roles as spiritual leaders, because we are so called for today. So thank you very much. I will talk to you on the next podcast. And until then, namaste.